Dr. Arevalo is a professor of politics and education who has taught at Hillsdale College, University of Dallas, and Florida State University. He currently serves as the Executive Vice Chancellor in the Division of Florida Colleges at the Florida Department of Education.
Thank you, Dr. Wheatland, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for your patience. We were held up a bit, so bear with us. You're here for the long haul, so I hear. I want to talk a little bit about laws in education during the American founding. There's a notion among some scholars, I'm sure none in this crowd, that the American founders didn't really care about education much. But I think, as my talk hopefully will show, and several other presentations during the conference, that view is gravely mistaken. They cared greatly. And their thoughts on education really flowed from their political theory. I know you all are probably well-versed. I mean, you've had a couple talks already about the American founding, and so you've probably heard a little bit about what their theory was, but at the risk of being repetitive, I want to briefly outline what that political theory was, because I'm going to refer back to it throughout the rest of my talk. And it's, if we're talking about laws on education, we ought to know a little bit about the theory that put in place those laws. So the purpose of government, according to the founding, was laid out by lots of foundational documents, but I want to refer to a couple of the early state constitutions that summarize this pretty well. So the Constitution of Massachusetts says that the end of government is to secure the existence of the body politic, to protect it, and to furnish the individuals who compose it with the power of enjoying in safety and tranquility their natural rights and the blessings of life. So it's to secure the existence of the body politic, protect it. The Virginia Constitution, one of the first Virginia Constitution, says something similar. It says, government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community. So again, this emphasis on security, protection. This view of government is summarized in the most famous founding document of all, the Declaration of Independence. The country is established to secure these rights. Governments are established to secure these rights. As a secondary objective, of course, it's to promote a happiness or common benefit, but these objectives are subordinate to that protection. All that a government does should relate in some way to this original end. And so this begs the question, well, should the government have anything to do with education? I mean, what does education have to do with protecting people, if that's the primary role of government? And this is where some scholars say, oh no, this is exactly the view of the purpose of government from the view of the founding, and therefore the founders didn't want government involved in education. They didn't really care that much about it. Libertarians often take this position, that government and education should not have almost anything to do with each other, or nothing to do with each other. So I hope to refute that view in this talk. I want to talk a little bit about why I'm going to talk about laws on education. There are some other speakers throughout this. I think one of my panelists, Dr. Kirwan, as well as Janet Richards, who you'll hear from tomorrow, they're going to speak about some of the most prominent founders and their views on education. I'm going to take a more boots on the ground approach, looking at the laws. I think the laws capture what the people on the ground really thought about education. And so this is the best reflection of what the founding generation as a generation thought, not what a couple of the brightest lights of that generation thought. So the first thing to note is that these laws, the founders all thought that education was a political institution. So the two were intertwined. And that government should play a role in the encouragement of education. This view goes all the way back to Aristotle, who in Book 8 of the Politics said, the legislator must make education, the education of the young, his object above all. So Aristotle in the Politics thought education and legislation went hand in hand. And the same idea is reflected in a 1787 charter of Pittsburgh School that states, the education of the youth ought to be the primary object with every government. It was the duty of governments to care for and promote education, both liberal and mechanical. Education is the first and foremost arena where the most important political concerns came to the fore. And I should note, when I say political concerns or politics, what I mean here is much more than the particular controversies that happen in the political arena of the day. Fundamentally, politics is about the communal decisions about what is right and wrong, just and unjust, advantageous and disadvantageous. What we ought to do and why. And this can be as broad as, what is murder, what constitutes murder versus self-defense, or as particular as should the city of Sarasota sign a municipal contract with a particular vendor. So obviously what is politics involves the controversies of the day, but it goes far beyond that. So with this view, you can begin to see why politics and education might go hand in hand. Well, the first question that, this being established, the first question that the founders actually needed to establish is, all right, well, what are the aims of education? What, from the perspective of government, what should government aim for when it encourages education? So this is a question of ends, and that's what I'm going to focus on in this presentation. I'm not going to focus on the means of education. How to do education? Some of my panelists, I'm sure, might discuss the means, but I want to focus on the ends. What do they aim at in educating a people? So I'm going to argue that there's three main ends from the perspective of government for education during the time of the founding. So first and foremost, they aimed to make citizens safe for society. Second, they aimed to cultivate patriotism and devotion to Republican ideals. And third, they aimed to encourage virtue, morality, and religion. And these second and third aims both relate to the first pretty directly. So the first aim, making citizens safe for society. So going back to that foundational idea, I'm obviously going back to the foundational idea of government, that according to the political theory of the American founding, the government had the responsibility of protecting its citizens, and the first, or one of the primary ways of doing this is by making citizens safe to live with each other. All right? And this might seem a little bit odd or paternalistic, but the founders had a really realistic view of human nature. They knew that man without civilization, without society, tends to be savage, that he needed to be taught how to act well. He needed to be civilized. There's a founding era act confirming allotments towards a charitable school in Pennsylvania that lays out this idea. It says, when education is neglected, poorly handled, or entrusted to dangerous and disaffected men, then children may end up troubling the peace of society, shaking the government, and often causing tumult, sedition, and bloodshed. Right, so the people without an education are the causes of sedition, tumult, and bloodshed. A charter from the University of Georgia connected the order in the minds of citizens to order in society. It says, The people's public prosperity and even existence very much depends upon suitably forming the minds and morals of citizens. When the minds of the people are, in general, viciously disposed and unprincipled, and their conduct disorderly, a free government will be attended with greater confusions and evils more horrid than the wild, uncultivated state of nature. It can only be happy where the public principles and opinions are properly directed and their manners regulated. So a citizen that is well educated is less likely to turn to criminal pursuits in order to make a living, and is more likely to be able to maintain himself and contribute in some positive way towards the needs of his fellow citizens. States, therefore, regularly funded poor schools all over the original 13 states. Some states, such as Virginia and South Carolina, banned lotteries, but they allowed an exception to finance educational institutions. So they thought better to have citizens involved in this minor vice, gambling or lottery system, than to have an unfunded education system. States apply the same notion to external threats too. The Pennsylvania legislature paid for the education of Native Americans so that when a Native American was educated, he might return to his tribe to disseminate the rudiments of useful knowledge among the Indians who reside in or near Pennsylvania, and to make them more amenable to their neighbors. So here we can kind of clearly see that this aim of protecting citizens, making them safe for each other, and even protecting those who surrounded the original 13 states was at the foundation of the funding and encouragement of education. Flowing from this, the founders aimed to encourage patriotism and attachment to Republican principles. So respect for the rule of law requires loyalty to the regime, and so the founders aimed to instill a public patriotic spirit. Many laws and institutions were chartered with the aim of instilling in the people this public spirit, this patriotic public spirit. So for example, a law in Virginia bid the trustees of Hampton-Sydney Academy, Hampton-Sydney, by the way, still exists today, it's now a college, and this law bid Hampton-Sydney to ensure that the teachers, quote, preserve in the minds of the students a sacred love and attachment to the principles of the glorious Revolution. Similarly, a 1789 Act on Education from Massachusetts encouraged Harvard University to teach students the principles upon which the Republican Constitution is structured. So Harvard had been a wellspring of patriotism. Many of the founders were educated there, and the state was relying on Harvard to strengthen other institutions in the state, to be that foundation for patriotic spirit. Down south in Georgia, they were conscious that political ideas espoused in other countries could pose a threat to the United States. And so therefore they enacted a law that temporarily stripped political rights from anyone under 16 who was, quote, sent abroad without the limits of the United States and resided there for 3 years for the purpose of receiving an education under a foreign power. So in other words, if you studied abroad and you came back, there was a danger that you might pick up principles that were against that patriotic spirit. And you might have been, looked at aristocratic or monarchical government in Europe and said, oh, that actually makes a lot more sense than this Republican experiment that the Americans are running here. And so they would be excluded from being able to vote or hold office until they spent some time back in their state, reacclimating themselves to the principles of the country. In the wake of the revolution, there were obviously those who didn't follow along with the revolution, the Tories. And these were often punished by land confiscation. And a lot of that land was put to use re-educating the country. So Virginia and Pennsylvania endowed several schools that had been with this land. And there was also concern that people who had been Tories would slip into the education system and teach children anti-American or anti-Republican ideas. So in order to guard against this, most states required educators in both public and private institutions to take oaths of loyalty to the state. Maryland, in particular, was preoccupied with stamping out Toryism. When a free school in St. Anne's County, in Queen Anne's County, neglected to have its administrators take this state oath, the General Assembly assigned it a permanent visitor to inspect it, administer the oaths, and ensure loyalty. In Virginia, students who graduated from academies, this is kind of the equivalent of high school, were required to take oaths of loyalty as well, as a prerequisite for graduation. Another charter school in Virginia laid out the requirement that, quote, in order to preserve in the minds of the students that sacred love and attachment to the principles of the glorious revolution, the greatest care and caution shall be used in electing such professors and masters to the end that no person shall be elected unless the uniform tenor of his conduct manifests to the world his sincere affection for the liberty and independence of the United States of America. So these requirements, again, reveal the link between education and the duty of state governments to ensure that citizens are protected. We can't have seditious students running around, and therefore we can't have seditious professors teaching those students. So educational institutions were seen as the primary means whereby the founding principles that created and united the country could be entrusted to the next generation. The third aim of education, again, flows pretty naturally and easily from this, the promotion of morality and Christian virtue. George Washington said in his farewell address that of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim to the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. So these requirements for Republican government were promoted in many state educational laws. To this end, Massachusetts directed schoolmasters to instill in students' minds a sense of piety, as well as other virtues such as courage and industriousness. Children learn from good example. To this end, the states wanted to ensure that the teachers were models of virtue. So several New England states required teachers to reside in the school district or at least have a minister or someone holding public office give a recommendation. This is the kind of the origin of letters of recommendation. It's a testament to their good character. In Connecticut, selectmen, kind of early members of city council, they were empowered to inspect schools and interrogate teachers to ensure that they were providing direction to the students in knowledge, religion, and good manners. So these state inspectors were not exclusive to New England. Georgia also established a board of visitors to supervise educational institutions and provide that same inspection, kind of from a statewide office. Some legislators even required trustees to be Christian, with the idea that a Christian is less likely to be lack virtue. This would help ensure that Christian morals were exemplified and taught, and in turn would cultivate virtue and morality in the students, contributing to the security of natural rights. This also applied to endowments. Those states gave very generously in property or monetary support at the foundation and maintenance of educational institutions. They often limited the amount of property an educational institution could own. And the purpose of these limitations seems to have been to prevent the unnecessary opulence or the inordinate accumulation of property. So this would help ensure that institutions remain true to their original mission instead of focusing on the accumulation of property, which is something that actually did happen in Europe at educational and monastic institutions in Europe. So to prevent this, they said an institution can only own so many acres of land, or the equivalent of so many dollars in property. So to bring this to a close, because I'm sure my fellow panelists are itching to come up here and flesh out what I'm laying out here. I want to bring this back to the theme that we're celebrating at this conference. These three ends of education have often been excised from our public educational institutions. But in this semi-quincentennial, we have an excellent opportunity for their recovery. In our day, many institutions provide something of an education that aims at employment, but they overblow that expectation somewhat by aiming that, or by preaching that everyone's going to be a leader, right? This has contributed partially to bring about a shortage of American-born plumbers, carpenters, welders, and it's led certain industries to bring in people from abroad to work when they can't find local native-born workers. And so this is something that I think we can work on. The educational institutions of the founding certainly aim to provide employment, kind of useful skills, as a primary objective to prevent the students during the founding from going on the dole, going on welfare. And yet today we have something like 20% of American citizens on welfare. So here in Florida, they've placed a very heavy emphasis on workforce education. And that's borne a lot of fruit. And I think that's something that the founders in this vein would have encouraged. Our institutions also ought to encourage real patriotism. There are many ways to do this, but just to name a couple, we should provide to our students examples of those who have loved their country and sacrificed for it. I think this morning you all attended a talk on George Washington. That's a primary or a prime example of someone who sacrificed for his country. But we should bring others, in as a way of modeling to our students what real patriotism looks like. The second recommendation is that our students should spend some time looking at the anthems and symbols of our national life. So we should, in our classroom, spend time dwelling on the poetic lyrics of the America the Beautiful, or the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the reasons why the Pledge of Allegiance was adopted, the symbolism and the roots of the Great Seal of the United States, and how Columbia, Lady Liberty, and Uncle Sam came to be visual embodiments of our people and its traditions. Finally, there's nothing that would prevent public schools from encouraging virtue. Even piety. We ought to have piety and reverence towards things that are greater than us. And so our public institutions ought to exist to encourage virtuous American citizens. And unless they're accomplishing that, really they are failing our students and our nation. So this celebration of our semi-quincentennial has really provided a prime opportunity to renew these ideals and bring them to the fore as a part of a renewal in education. Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.